Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD, pro physique athlete. Today I'm going to be sharing 5 of the best hypertrophy splits set up for 6 days per week. Figuring out what split you want to follow is one of the first decisions you need to make when choosing a program for bodybuilding. I've experimented quite a bit with different splits, and I'm going to be sharing some of the insights I've gained. This is going to be geared more towards the intermediate to advanced athlete. If you are a true beginner, you probably don't actually need 6 days in the gym per week. So keep in mind that some of the considerations I'll be talking about today are more geared towards advanced people. Also note that there are lots of variations of splits out there, but I've chosen a few here for representation. We're going to be counting down from 5th to 1st. And for each split, I'll walk you through the setup and talk about the pros and cons briefly. Okay, coming in at number 5 is the Haney split. Haney was an 8-time Mr. Olympia, and this is one of the splits that he liked. The setup for 6 days is as follows. You have chest and arms day number 1, leg day number 1, back and shoulders 1, then chest and arms 2, legs 2, back and shoulders 2, and rest. So we're repeating this 3-day segment twice in the week for 6 days a week. Notice that this is basically a modified version of push-pull legs. You've moved the days around a little bit, you've moved your bicep training off of pull day onto chest and arm day, and then you've taken shoulders off of chest day and put it onto back day. I actually quite like these modifications to the traditional push-pull leg split. Let's start off by talking about the pros of this split. First of all, you get to train your biceps when they're fresh on this chest and arm day. One of the big downfalls of the push-pull leg split is the fact that you have to train your biceps when they're fatigued after back training. Your biceps do get involved indirectly in your back pulling movements, so when you have biceps coming after back on a pull day, you won't perform as well for your direct bicep work. When you look at volume from the perspective of sets times reps times weight lifted, you'll see that if you're not performing as well, you won't accumulate as much volume, and this won't be as good for hypertrophy. Now, another thing I like about the split is the fact that you split up chest from shoulder training. Often our shoulders are put second place in priority to chest in pushing type days, and this means you won't get much priority for any overhead pressing. If you do have strength goals for overhead pressing, it can be nice to split your chest and shoulder training. Also, this effectively gives you a higher frequency of pressing work since you have more opportunities to put pressing movements in. This can be good for strength development and also distributes a bit of your tricep and a little bit of your chest work. When you overhead press, you do involve a little bit of your upper pecs. I typically don't count it that way officially, but it is something to consider. The other thing I like about the split is that you get a high frequency for arm training. When you consider the fact that arms get trained indirectly with your pushing and pulling movements, you'll see that they actually get a 4 times per week frequency in this split. Your biceps are trained directly on chest and arm days, and they get trained indirectly with your back training on back and shoulder days. Likewise, your shoulders are trained directly on your chest and arms days, but also get involved indirectly with shoulder training if you're using overhead pressing. You'll see in my example of the program that we only put overhead pressing on this shoulder day, so your triceps might be getting hit more like 3 times per week. Okay, now let's talk about cons of the split. Disadvantages of the Haney split. First thing to point out here is that back training comes after leg training. And I don't like this because a heavy leg day can impact your back training. And in general, you want to divide up your heavy axial loading as much as possible across the week, which usually comes in the form of heavy squats, deadlifts, and rows. This is why in general, you'll see in my programs, I tend to try and split up leg and back training as much as possible throughout the week to distribute fatigue. Now, depending on how advanced you are, this may not be as big an issue. For example, if you're a beginner, you're just not moving that much weight to generate a lot of fatigue. But if you are more advanced like we're talking about in this video, then it can be an issue. Next problem with the split is the fact that chest comes after shoulders in the middle of the week. A lot of people get antsy when you start having back-to-back days with muscle groups that could interfere. For example, if you put a heavy overhead press on this day, it could potentially impact your chest training the day after. You'll see in my example program of the split that I basically put our heavy overhead press on this day only, which gets around this problem because now on this shoulder day, you're not putting overhead pressing, which won't interfere with your chest training. So keep in mind that there are modifications to get around the disadvantages with these splits. Okay, coming in at number 4 is the modified push-pull leg split. Push-pull legs is one of the most popular splits in bodybuilding, but I actually have a lot of problems with the traditional split as written. So for a disclaimer, if we were talking about the pure push-pull leg split as written, I actually wouldn't even include it in these 5 splits in this video. But when you make some of the modifications that I like to, as you've seen in my programs, then it can be a pretty decent option. First of all, with ordering of the days, this is what I like. Pull, push, legs, and then rest. Swapping around the order of the days is important for fatigue distribution, as we've mentioned before. The idea is that you want to spread out your heavy pull and leg training as much as possible across the week. When we swap push and pull days, this push day gives us a nice little buffer between our heavy pulling work and leg work. Now the other modification you'll see I'll make is I'll take bicep training off of pull day and swap it with side delt training from push day. This way biceps can get trained when they're fresh on push days and shoulders can be moved over onto pull day. In terms of the pros of this split, I do like push-pull legs in the fact that it is very intuitive to program. I get it that a lot of people don't want to think too much about their training, and having a push-pull leg setup at least gives you some structure to follow when you're going into the gym. The other thing that's nice about it is with push-pull legs, you don't have interference between muscle groups. So you won't have muscles that get trained 2 days in a row, which can be tricky for less experienced people to program. Now, in terms of cons of the push-pull leg split, one of the first issues that comes up is the fact that your arms get trained after pushing and pulling movements on the same days. When you run things as traditionally written, you'll have biceps coming after back on pull days and triceps coming after chest on push days. This means you won't be performing as well on your direct arm training. Note that we're talking about modified push-pull legs here, so we've moved our biceps off of pull day onto push day. So with this split, that issue actually has been solved for biceps. The triceps do get affected still since they do come after chest on pushing days. Another issue with this program, which actually applies to several of the splits in this video, is that you have tough leg days. You'll notice that we have 4 upper body days to just 2 leg days. Now it is true that you do have more muscles in your upper body to train, so having more upper body days does make sense to even out your volume. However, since legs are the toughest muscle groups to train, this ends up giving you some uneven fatigue distribution where you have really tough leg days and relatively easier upper body days. Another issue with this split is you tend to have uneven days. In particular, pull days tend to be a bit shorter since you have fewer muscle groups to train. Now in this modified split, we've put shoulders onto pull days, and this can actually help to mitigate things because you know I like to put lots of side delt work into my programs. So it actually gives you more of an opportunity to get in more shoulder training. Alright, moving along here, coming in at number 3 is the Arnold split. I think this is actually one of the best splits for 6 days per week. It's a highly underrated split that has a lot of advantages that people don't recognize. As you know, I actually work the Arnold split into a lot of other programming setups. So keep in mind that the Arnold split structure doesn't always have to be for 6 days per week. Here's the split. You have chest and back day number 1, shoulders and arms 1, legs 1, and then repeat. Chest and back 2, shoulders and arms 2, legs 2, and rest. You'll see that this differs from push-pull legs since you split up your upper body training into chest and back and shoulders and arms. And this pairing is the essence of the Arnold split. This gives us a few advantages. First of all, with the Arnold split, you get to train your shoulders and arms when they're fresh. I think it's really valuable to have a direct shoulder and arm day, particularly for natural since a lot of you guys are lacking in shoulders and arms. The next thing that happens when you split off your shoulder and arm training is that you get a high frequency for your arms, where your arms are being trained 4 times per week. They get trained indirectly with your chest and back pushing and pulling movements, and then they get trained directly with your arm training. This works really nicely to split up some of the stress on your arms and allows you to accumulate more productive volume for them. Pairing chest and back and shoulders and arms also is really nice for antagonist supersets. That is, you can alternate pushing and pulling and bicep and tricep training in a way that really saves time without sacrificing productivity. Another advantage of the Arnold split is that you get some priority for your accessory pressing. Typically your accessory presses like close grip bench, overhead press, and heavy dips get relegated to after chest training on push days, for example. This also tends to happen in the upper body split, for example. But with the Arnold split here, since you have this dedicated shoulder and arm day, you can put some of those accessory presses onto this day and have it first in that day, so you get some priority for it. This can be helpful in developing those lifts as well. In terms of cons of the Arnold split, the main one people will talk about is the fact that you have shoulders and arms coming back to back. Now there is a workaround to this, and that is that you put your heavy overhead pressing on one of the shoulder and arm days, and then you put your main heavy horizontal pressing work for your chest on your other chest and back day earlier in the week. Then since you have easier chest movements on the second chest and back day, you won't have issues when those 2 days come back to back. Keep in mind that this also isn't that big of an issue if you know how to auto-regulate properly. As you become more advanced, you should be able to modify your training from day to day so that you can precisely control the amount of stimulus you're producing. So as long as you're not going balls to the wall on both of these days back to back, it shouldn't be that much of a problem. Now, one other small disadvantage of this split is that you have suboptimal fatigue distribution. That is, when you look at these days, you'll see that your shoulder and arm day is significantly easier than your leg day. This isn't the worst example of fatigue distribution. The worst would probably be a bro split where you have a dedicated arm day and then a dedicated leg day, and you're training everything just once per week. in those programs you tend to have a mega leg day that far eclipses your arm day in terms of fatigue. So there's the Arnold split. I really like this setup, and I might actually even rank it higher if we were talking about less advanced individuals. When you become more advanced, you're able to start playing with higher frequencies since you're able to auto-regulate like we just talked about. This allows you to get more creative with your splits and gives you more freedom to program. And coming into higher frequency territory brings us to our next split on the list. And that is number 2, modified full body. Full body training seems to have fallen out of favor in recent times, but I actually think there are a lot of powerful advantages to training full body. And this applies to even higher frequencies, like up to 6 days per week. So here's a split setup. You better appreciate the fact that I wrote out the word full body 6 times. But the key thing I want to emphasize is that we're talking about modified full body here. So we're not necessarily training every single muscle group with each of these quote full body sessions. As you start getting more advanced, you want to start figuring out optimal frequencies for each muscle group, which can be different. So optimally speaking, you won't always want to train each muscle group the same number of times per week. Now this starts getting complicated, which is why this video is for more advanced people. But basically, to set up this kind of modified split, you'll start off with a program where all muscle groups are getting trained in each workout, and then you'll selectively subtract muscle groups from certain days to balance things out. For example, in a program where you're prioritizing your back, you might train your back on every workout, but you might only train your chest 3 times per week. Let's talk about the pros of the modified full body setup. The main advantage is that this kind of setup is maximally customizable. This is the most fluid type of programming because once we say modified full body, you can basically make any modification you want to under the sun. In general, for something to be called a full body workout, I usually expect there to be some upper body and lower body training mixed together. So I wouldn't count any program to be just a modified full body split. But since you have this customizability, you can really control the amount of volume and frequency for each muscle group. As we just said, if you really want to prioritize your back, you just train back on every workout, and you can very easily customize the training for each muscle group this way. Now, the next advantage of this program is that you get a high frequency for all muscle groups. This can be really helpful if, for example, you're trying to build strength in a certain movement. It would be really easy, for example, to bench 3 times a week if you wanted to. And it can also be a nice feeling to know that you're touching every muscle group with high frequencies. One of the main advantages of having a high frequency is your ability to increase volume. So in that example of prioritizing back, if we put back on every workout, we'd really be able to jack up the volume for our back training and perform well across all sets. If you put 4 sets back on each day here, you'd end up having 24 sets a week, and you'd perform those 24 sets way better than if you tried to put 24 sets of back into one back workout. Finally, with full body training, you get excellent fatigue distribution. That is, since you're splitting up your leg and upper body training throughout the week, you don't have one day that's really tough and other days that are much easier. This becomes more important for advanced athletes. For example, for me, I generate a lot of fatigue from a leg day, and after a tough leg day, I'll be so trashed when I get home that I'll just want to take a nap. When I was training full body last year, prepping for Worlds, it really helped me to cope with fatigue. Now, in terms of cons of this kind of approach, first of all, this requires a lot of auto-regulation. If there are muscle groups you're training every workout or almost with every workout, you're gonna have to be able to roll with the punches and modify your workouts on the fly. The best way is to know how to train to an RIR. So knowing that you're really fatigued from the training from the day before, you have the ability to modify your workout to make it a little bit easier the next day. And in general, you should be able to titrate your stimulus so that you're not overdoing it on any one day. This is something that takes experience to develop. Other cons of full body training: some people don't like training full body because you don't get as much of a pump. That is, you're not doing as many sets for any one muscle group. I don't think this is much of an issue for more advanced athletes because once you have a good mind-muscle connection and you have good technique, you're gonna be able to get a great pump even from just a couple of sets for a certain muscle group. Now, the only reason I didn't rank this first on the list is that it can be a bit tricky to program. Once you start getting into high numbers like 6 days a week, it can become a juggling act trying to slot muscle groups in across the week. But if you are advanced, I do recommend at some point trying a high frequency full body approach. Finally, we get to number 1 on the list today, and that is the upper-lower split. As you guys know, I really like the upper-lower split. It's a really powerful setup for 4, 5, and 6 days per week. Here's my layout for 6 days per week: upper lower, upper lower, upper lower, and rest. The only thing to note here is that when you have upper lower body days coming back to back, it's nice to put the upper body day first because a really tough lower body day can impact your upper body training the next day, but not so much the other way around. You'll notice that this does happen later in the week, But this isn't as much of an issue in this higher frequency setup because your leg training is split up over more days. Since we have 3 lower body days in this program, we can split up our fatiguing leg training across 3 days instead of 2 days in some of those other splits like push-pull legs and the Arnold split. Now, in terms of advantages of this split, I think the 3 times per week frequency is a nice middle ground for a lot of people, where it allows you to play with that higher frequency territory without having to deal with all the logistics that come with trying to program a high frequency full body. But this higher 3 times per week frequency will allow you to split up lots of volume if desired. This setup is also very convenient for powerlifting training. So if you want to slot in a strength type program, it would work well in this kind of setup. In some of those other splits like push-pull legs, say if you want to squat with a higher frequency, you wouldn't be able to squat more than 2 times per week since you only have 2 leg days. Now, in terms of cons of the upper-lower split, in general, the upper-lower split tends to favor your lower body a little bit. This is because there are more muscle groups to train on your upper body days than on lower body days. So either your upper body days tend to be longer or you'll have difficulty fitting in enough volume for your upper body. Another issue with this split is that, as we've talked about before, your shoulder and arm training comes after your heavy pushing and pulling on upper body days. This is just an inherent disadvantage to the upper lower split, but note that this doesn't become as much of a problem when we start getting into higher frequencies. Once you start splitting up your training over 3 times per week or more, you just don't have as much volume in any given workout. Your biceps and triceps won't be as fatigued going into your direct arm work, just because you haven't had to do as many sets of chest and back as you would if, say for example, condensed over just 2 days in the week. And by the time you get to high frequencies like full body like we talked about earlier, this problem basically becomes a non-issue. Do you guys agree with my ranking today? Let me know in the comments below. Keep in mind that training splits are very individual, so a lot of the exact ranking we talked about today is quite arbitrary. And this doesn't necessarily mean that upper lower is inherently better than the Arnold split, for example, or other comparisons in between. So remember that you really have to consider your own training goals and programming needs when choosing a program. If you want to see me rank some 5-day splits, check out this video where I go through the same thing, except talking about bodybuilding setups for 5 days per week. For the most up-to-date and practical science-based fitness knowledge, make sure you subscribe to the channel and we'll see you next time.